Havana, December 1946. Before neon lit the Nevada desert, before Las Vegas learned how to sin profitably, an American criminal empire was already operating in plain sight, 90 miles from Florida. This wasn't a back-alley racket. It was a billion-dollar vision, built by some of the most disciplined, calculating men in organized crime history, protected by politicians, financed by U.S. money, and undone not by the FBI, but by a revolution no one in the room believed could actually win. By the time the smoke cleared in 1959, the Mafia hadn't just lost casinos, they lost the future. And Havana, once the most profitable city in American organized crime, became the one that got away.
In December of 1946, while most Americans were celebrating the end of World War II, a quieter gathering took place in Havana, one that would shape the city's destiny for the next decade. Inside the Hotel Nacional, the American Mafia held its most important summit since Prohibition. Lucky Luciano, recently deported but still powerful, sat alongside Meyer Lansky, the mob's financial architect. Around them were bosses from New York, Chicago, Tampa, and New Orleans. The topic wasn't drugs or violence. It was real estate, casinos, legitimacy. Cuba, they believed, offered something Las Vegas didn't yet have: proximity, permissive laws, and a government that could be bought cleanly and cheaply. This wasn't chaos. It was corporate crime, carefully planned, cautiously expanded. And unlike the myth, Havana wasn't a poor backwater waiting to be rescued. It was already modern, cultured, and economically diverse. What the Mafia wanted wasn't to build Cuba from nothing. They wanted to own the parts that printed cash.
Meyer Lansky wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He didn't scream, he didn't posture, he calculated. By the late 1940s, Lansky understood something critical. Cuba's real value wasn't just casinos, it was stability under Batista. Contrary to later myths, Lansky never believed Batista was invincible. He believed something else, that any rational government would protect tourism revenue. And in that assumption, he made the most expensive mistake of his life. Lansky pushed millions into Havana's nightclubs, hotels, and gaming rooms. The Riviera, the Nacional, the Montmartre. These weren't shacks, they were world-class venues competing with Paris and New York. Tourism wasn't Cuba's largest industry. Sugar, tobacco, and cattle still dominated, but tourism paid in fast, untraceable cash. To Lansky, this wasn't exploitation, it was partnership. To history, it would become a wager against ideology.
When Fulgencio Batista seized power in 1952, the Mafia didn't panic. They celebrated. Batista offered exactly what organized crime needed: predictability. For a price, casinos were legalized. Licenses were guaranteed. Police enforcement became optional. In return, Batista received millions in kickbacks. Some paid directly, others funneled through shell corporations and hotel partnerships. Havana didn't become lawless. It became selectively lawful. American corporations followed: AT&T, Coca-Cola, massive U.S. sugar investments. This wasn't a criminal island cut off from the world. It was deeply plugged into American capital. Workers in casinos earned more than doctors would later make under the revolutionary state. The nightlife flourished. The money flowed. But beneath the glamour, resentment grew. Not because Cuba was backward, but because wealth was unevenly protected. And in the mountains, a movement was watching, waiting, and learning.
The popular myth says the Mafia built Havana. The truth is more complicated and more unsettling. By the early 1950s, Havana was already one of the most modern cities in the Americas. It had world-class nightclubs, a thriving middle class, and cutting-edge infrastructure. Cuba would soon become the second country in the Western Hemisphere to broadcast color television. Venues like the Sanssouci and Montmartre weren't mafia inventions. They were Cuban institutions, refined long before Luciano ever set foot on the island. What the mob did wasn't creation, it was concentration. They injected American capital into the most profitable sectors, casinos, hotels, nightlife, while leaving the broader economy untouched. Sugar still ruled, tobacco still exported, cattle still grazed. But the skyline told a different story, one of excess, visibility, and foreign control. And that visibility would soon become a liability no amount of money could erase.
Meyer Lansky was watching the numbers, but not the people. In 1953, Fidel Castro attacked the Moncada barracks. The assault failed. Castro was arrested, exiled, forgotten by most power brokers, including the Mafia. To Lansky, this was background noise. Revolutions had failed before. Batista had survived coups, protests, and scandals. And history suggested that when rebels won, they still needed money, tourism money. Lansky assumed negotiation was inevitable, that rational actors would prevail. What he failed to understand was ideology. Castro's movement wasn't seeking a better deal, it was rejecting the entire system that made deals possible. While casinos expanded and profits soared, the revolution wasn't fighting for wages alone, it was fighting symbols. And no symbol was louder than an American-backed casino glowing over a Cuban neighborhood at night. By the mid-1950s, whispers reached Havana's casinos. Rebels were no longer hiding. They were advancing. Some mobsters remembered a lesson later immortalized in fiction. When your enemy is willing to die, your leverage disappears. Casino managers noticed subtle changes, soldiers hesitating, police disappearing, bribes losing their effect. Batista's grip was still firm in Havana, but it was loosening everywhere else. The Mafia considered options, more money, more security. Some even floated mercenary solutions, ideas quietly dismissed as impractical and politically radioactive. The CIA watched. The State Department hesitated. No one wanted fingerprints. The mob had built an empire that depended on stability, but had no army to defend it. And for the first time since Prohibition, organized crime faced an enemy it couldn't intimidate, bribe, or outweight. New Year's Eve, 1958. Inside Havana's casinos, champagne flowed. Bands played. Dealers worked the tables. But behind the smiles was panic. Batista's inner circle was already packing. In the early hours of January 1st, Batista fled Cuba. By dawn, it was over. Revolutionaries entered Havana not as looters, but as accountants of vengeance. Casinos were shut down, gaming tables overturned. Mob investments, hundreds of millions in today's dollars, were instantly worthless. There were no negotiations, no transition period, no deal for Meyer Lansky. Within weeks, the empire that had taken over a decade to build vanished without a single bullet fired at a mob boss. Havana didn't burn. It went silent. And the American Mafia learned a brutal truth. You can buy governments, but you can't buy revolutions. In the months after the revolution, Havana's grandest buildings stood intact, but hollow. The Riviera, the Nacional, the Sanssouci. Their lights were off, their gaming floors sealed. The revolution didn't destroy the Mafia's empire, it froze it. Casino workers, once among the best-paid service employees in the Caribbean, were reassigned or dismissed. A waiter who had earned more than a doctor under the old system now earned the same as everyone else. Equality came swiftly. Opportunity did not. The new government framed this as moral cleansing. To many Cubans, it felt like whiplash.
Tourism collapsed almost overnight, not because Havana lost its beauty, but because it lost its function in the American imagination. The mob's absence didn't just remove corruption, it removed liquidity. And for the first time, the cost of purity began to surface.
Meyer Lansky didn't flee in panic. He waited. From Miami and New York, he sent feelers, indirect, cautious, hopeful. He still believed what had always worked before. Money talks. Lansky assumed Castro would eventually face reality, that foreign tourism dollars would become necessary, that ideology would bend to economics. It never did. Castro didn't want a cut. He wanted control. Every attempt at contact was ignored or quietly shut down. Lansky's empire wasn't nationalized, it was erased. By the early 1960s, Lansky was no longer a kingpin. He was a man with memories, lawsuits, and a shrinking circle of influence. He had bet against human belief and lost. In organized crime, that's the only loss you can't recover from. As the Mafia's grip vanished, the United States faced an uncomfortable truth. Havana hadn't just been a gangster playground, it had been economically intertwined with American power. Sugar quotas collapsed, corporate franchises withdrew, diplomatic relations froze. The CIA explored options, covert pressure, exile armies, deniability. But restoring casinos was never the goal. The Cold War had moved on. Organized crime, once tolerated as a stabilizing force, became expendable. The mob had mistaken proximity for protection. 90 miles wasn't close enough. And while Las Vegas quietly cleaned itself up, pushing mobsters out one license at a time, Havana was sealed off entirely. One city adapted. The other became a monument to an alternate timeline.
The question lingers because it has no clean answer. What would Havana have become if the revolution had failed? Some believe the Mafia would have been pushed out, just as it was in Las Vegas, leaving behind infrastructure, capital, and a booming tourist economy. Others argue corruption would have calcified, flattening culture under concrete and neon. What's certain is this: the mob didn't underestimate Cuba's intelligence, they underestimated its resolve. Havana wasn't a victim city, it was a battleground of systems, capitalism, nationalism, and ideology colliding in real time. The Mafia lost everything. Cuba gained sovereignty and paid a price still debated decades later. And the ghosts of that unfinished future still walk Havana's streets. Every night, the lights stay dim.
After the casinos closed, rumors spread quietly through Miami and New Orleans that the mob would return, that Castro wouldn't last, that Cuba would reopen for business. Those rumors died at the Bay of Pigs. When the U.S.-backed invasion collapsed in 1961, it sent a clear message, not just to Washington, but to organized crime. There would be no rollback, no restoration, no second act. For the Mafia, this wasn't just a geopolitical loss. It was final confirmation that Havana was gone forever. Unlike Las Vegas, where mob influence faded gradually under federal pressure, Cuba offered no exit strategy. Assets were seized, records destroyed. The mob didn't lose a city. They lost an entire offshore system that had once insulated them from American law enforcement. And there would be no replacement.
The contrast couldn't have been sharper. In Las Vegas, federal pressure forced the Mafia out, but the city lived on. Corporations replaced mobsters. Neon stayed lit. The money kept flowing. Havana had no such transition. With gambling outlawed and American tourism severed, the infrastructure built for excess had no purpose. Hotels became offices. Ballrooms became storage. Nightclubs became memories. The revolution preserved Havana's colonial heart, ironically saving parts of the city that unchecked development might have erased. But preservation came with paralysis. Where Vegas evolved, Havana paused. And the longer the pause lasted, the harder it became to imagine the city as anything other than a relic of interrupted ambition.
Decades later, the argument still divides audiences. Some say the Mafia only took a cut, while communism took everything. Others argue that corruption hollowed out trust long before Castro arrived. The truth is less comfortable than either side admits. The mob extracted wealth, but it rewarded productivity. The state promised equality, but flattened incentive. One system concentrated power quietly, the other did it openly. For ordinary Cubans, the choice was never theoretical. It was lived, through ration cards, censored newspapers, and closed borders. The revolution didn't fail because the Mafia was gone. It failed because control replaced adaptability. And Havana, once flexible, opportunistic, alive, became rigid by design. Yet Havana never disappeared. Against every prediction, it endured, scarred, slowed, but standing. Its architecture survived. Its culture adapted underground. Music, art, and memory filled the spaces money once occupied. What the Mafia built didn't vanish. It fossilized. And what the revolution preserved became a time capsule of unresolved history. Today, visitors don't see a gangster paradise or a revolutionary utopia. They see layers, a city shaped by ambition, interrupted by ideology, and frozen between what was and what might have been. The Mafia lost Havana in a single night, but Havana has been living with that loss and that victory ever since. Over the decades, outsiders kept asking the same question. Why not reopen the casinos? The buildings were still there. The demand certainly was. Tourism could have returned billions to the island. But for the Cuban government, gambling wasn't just an industry. It was a symbol of humiliation. Casinos represented foreign leverage, unequal access, and a past defined by who paid whom. Reopening them would have meant admitting that the old system worked, at least economically, and ideology doesn't survive on admissions. So the roulette wheels stayed boxed, the tables stayed covered. Havana chose consistency over cash, and with that decision, it permanently severed itself from the world that once made it rich and vulnerable.
Organized crime didn't collapse with Havana. It adapted. The Mafia shifted operations back to the United States. Construction unions, waste hauling, offshore banking, Las Vegas real estate. Less visible, more regulated. But something irreplaceable was gone. Cuba had offered distance, ambiguity, a place where American law stopped at the shoreline. No other location ever replaced that function. By the time federal prosecutions dismantled the old families in the 1980s, Havana was no longer a missed opportunity. It was a closed chapter. The mob never tried again. In crime history, that silence says more than any confession.
As decades passed, the revolution aged, along with the men who led it. The promises remained, the slogans endured, but the economy strained under isolation. When limited tourism returned in the 1990s, it did so cautiously. No casinos, no private ownership, no American mob money. Foreign visitors came for nostalgia, not opportunity. Havana became famous again, but as a preserved artifact, not a living competitor to Miami or Vegas. What once terrified Washington now felt distant. The revolution had survived, but at the cost of relevance. And the city that once terrified American law enforcement now survived on memory.
History leaves some doors permanently ajar. What if Batista had reformed instead of fled? What if the mob had given back just enough to blunt resentment? What if Cuba had followed Las Vegas, expelling gangsters but keeping the infrastructure? There are no answers, only evidence of momentum interrupted. Cuba didn't lack intelligence, talent, or culture. What it lacked after 1959 was flexibility. And in the modern world, flexibility is survival. That's the tragedy buried beneath the crime story. Not what was stolen, but what could no longer change.
The American Mafia spent years building Havana. It took one night to lose it. No shootout, no final stand, just a flight, a silence, and locked doors. What vanished wasn't just money, but a model, a way of blending crime, capitalism, and government into something dangerously efficient. Havana didn't defeat the Mafia by force. It outlasted it by refusing to play the game at all. And in that refusal lies the paradox at the heart of this story. The mob lost everything. Cuba gained control, and history is still arguing about who paid the higher price. Walk Havana today, and the past is never far. Behind boarded doors and peeling facades are ballrooms that once rang with laughter, deals, and music that never reached the daylight. No plaques mark where the Mafia ruled. No memorials note where fortunes were lost in a single morning. The ghosts here aren't gangsters, they're possibilities. A different economy, a different relationship with the world, a different future paused mid-sentence. The revolution erased the mob completely, but it couldn't erase the question of what Havana might have become if corruption had been confronted instead of replaced. History doesn't reward purity or profit. It only records what survives, and Havana survives, bearing every layer of its unfinished story.
The Mafia didn't own Havana. They rented its future until the bill came due. For a brief moment in history, American organized crime believed it had outsmarted governments, ideology, and time itself. They were wrong. Havana taught them the final lesson. Power without legitimacy is temporary, and wealth without roots disappears overnight. The mob lost its Caribbean empire. Cuba gained sovereignty and isolation. Neither outcome delivered the paradise either side imagined. What remains is a city suspended between eras, still beautiful, still resilient, still haunted by a path not taken. This wasn't just the story of how the Mafia lost Havana. It's the story of how history never lets anyone keep everything they take.